Hello, and welcome to this latest episode of the Driving Net Profit with Zero Emissions podcast. I am Barbara Albert, co-CEO of 100% Renewables, a consultancy specializing in the development of net zero strategies. Today, we're speaking with the Mullion Group, a global software and consulting company highly sought after for its expertise in greenhouse gas inventory systems for the land sector. The Mullion Group is a developer of FLINTpro, the world's first land-based data integration software system with capability to measure, report, and manage climate impact for the agriculture, forestry, and land use sector, and also for large corporates and financial institutions with land portfolio assets and land investment strategies. FLINTpro is unique due to its data agnostic design, meaning that data inputs from satellites, ground measurements and models can be combined and processed into the most useful and relevant information needed to meet land sector policy requirements and guidelines, environmental reporting, and land management decisions. Joining me today is Rob Waterworth, CEO of FLINTpro and the Mullion Group. Rob has extensive experience in land sector monitoring and management, focusing on greenhouse gas estimation and policy development. He worked from project to national scales, designing and developing several operational land sector inventories, emissions projection systems, and technical processes for nesting projects within national systems to support emissions trading. He has authored several papers on monitoring systems and in 2007 was part of the team awarded the Eureka Prize, Australia's premier science prize, for work in developing integrated remote sensing and ground data systems. Rob is currently leading the development of new international monitoring tools for forestry and agriculture, including FLINTpro. Hi, Rob, and welcome to the Driving Net Profit with Zero Emissions show.
Thanks very much, Barbara. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Rob, as you know, a big part of our work is the development of decarbonization and net zero strategies and helping our clients achieve carbon neutrality under climate active. Increasingly, we get questions from clients that have large parcels of land and a commitment to go to net zero, whether they can use their own land for carbon removals, either as part of achieving their own net zero goal or preparing for climate active carbon neutrality. And this is also actually how we found out about you and FLINTpro, because one of our clients in Queensland told us about the wonderful work you're doing and connected me with you. So Rob, could you please start by telling our listeners more about your companies, the Mullion Group and specifically FLINTpro?
Sure, thanks very much. Yes, so the Mullion Group is a team of experts in land sector carbon accounting. The company is nearly 9 years old, but most of us have been working in the field for well over 20 years at this point, having originally worked on designing and building Australia's national systems starting in the late 90s. So we have a very deep understanding of carbon accounting, not just in Australia, but the entire world round through various processes, including the IPCC and global forest observation initiatives. Over the last 5 years specifically, we've really been working to develop new software packages that can really streamline the way organisations can get access to information on emissions removals in the land sector. And that piece of software is called FLINTpro. It's an online software as a service system that fills a specific need, which is how do you integrate all of the different types of data that can help you estimate your emissions and removals in the land sector. So there's lots of options. There's remote sensing data, there's carbon cycle models, there's emissions factors, there's management information. All of these things need to come together in a package to give you a really accurate view of what's happening on your land. And that's exactly what FLINTpro does, and that's how we met.
And before we go deep into what FLINTpro does, I feel like we've got to get a couple of basic questions out of the way, because it's easy to understand that when we drive our petrol or our diesel car, that it causes emissions. And when we consume electricity, it causes emissions because most of our grid is powered from fossil fuel power plants. So that's easy to picture and easy to understand. But the land is both a carbon emitter and it's a carbon sink. How does this work? Can you tell us more about how this works?
Sure, it's really interesting, and it's what makes the land sector quite unique. is that it obviously, as you said, can either emit carbon or sequester carbon. In any specific year, a single piece of land can do both, which makes it even more challenging. Some carbon pools may be emitting, some carbon pools may be sequestering. And that's obviously been one of the challenges of estimating emissions and removals in the land sector in the past. But in some ways, if you just think about it as a piece of land and think about what might happen to that, you can fairly easily come up with the concepts of what's good and what's bad. So obviously, if you have a forest and you were to cut that forest down and burn the material, you're going to be emitting greenhouse gas emissions in that year. And then there will be legacy impacts of that. For example, in soil carbon, the soil carbon may continuously decline for a number of years after those clearings. The other option, of course, is if you've got land that's been cleared for a very long time and you start putting trees on it, then those trees will grow, those will sequester carbon back into the landscape. But again, in the future, you may decide to harvest those. You then get a whole lot of other pieces of things looking at, say, products. So wood products, for example, may be stored for a very long time. There's other carbon pools like that. And obviously, of late, there's been a really keen interest in soil carbon, with soil carbon declining under poor management practices and generally stabilising or increasing with better management practices. So it is a complex space, but when you break it down to the very simple concepts of what's happening on your land, it's not that dissimilar to many other areas of greenhouse gas accounting.
Okay, great. So just to drill deeper with that, so say we're talking about lots of people when they think about land as a way of sequestering carbon, they think about planting trees. How does it work when you plant vegetation such as trees? How is carbon sequestered from the atmosphere? And you mentioned soil carbon. How does this work?
Sure. So the main process is obviously something we probably all learnt back in high school or even in primary school these days, is all around photosynthesis. So as you plant trees, those trees grow, they're photosynthesizing and they're pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they are storing that in timber and other, or wood, bark, branches, roots, all of those types of things. So typically what you'll find with most forests is you can plant new trees. They'll take a little while to start growing, so not a lot of carbon in the early years. They'll then accelerate, start sequestering a fair bit of carbon. And then as they get older and older, they'll really start to slow down and mature, and may actually cease sequestering carbon once they get a lot older than a few hundred years. So there's this basic pattern, and of course you can interrupt that pattern at any time with, say, harvesting or other implications such as fire. So you do need, and that's a big issue in Australia. So you need to think about the life cycle of a forest going forward. Soil in itself is not necessarily all that different, although what's happening is you are generally feeding the soil carbon from plants and from management. So if you are undertaking poor management, not enough carbon's getting into the soil, or you're taking practices that increase the loss of carbon from the soil, then you'll be emitting. But many of the new regenerative agricultural practices that people are promoting are really starting to look at how, at the very least, slowing that decline and potentially turning it around and starting to sequester again.
Thank you so much for that explanation. That makes a lot of sense. So going back to what I said earlier with companies, or actually understanding where our emissions come from by driving our cars that are petrol and diesel powered, our energy consumption, which is from fossil fuel power plants. Lots of organizations we work with are developing the carbon footprint, and many do indeed start with that energy consumption. So their gas, electricity, their petrol, fleet, diesel, everything. And some are starting to look into the value chain emissions. But only, as I mentioned previously, only a few companies are currently reporting or even considering their emissions from land-based activities. And part of the problem seems to be that there are not many standards out there that help with explaining how carbon accounting in the land sector works. Now, I understand that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, led by the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, are working on a carbon removals and land sector initiative that will allow companies to account for those carbon removals and the storage, the land use change, and also bioenergy. Can you tell us more about the pilot that's currently underway? Because I think I know that you're one of the actual authors of that new standard that's going to come out. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. Look, I can come back, and you're quite right. One of the challenges across all of carbon accounting and the land sector is what guidance and protocols do you need to apply to calculate your footprints, and where does the line get drawn? And this has been obviously an issue for many years. The land sector has traditionally fallen behind a little bit on this. There's certainly been a lot of high-level national guidelines, obviously, through things like the IPCC processes. There's been a lot of support through the Global Forest Observation Initiative in the past, things like that.
What is that?
So the GFOI was actually a partnership set up years ago to help support developing countries to implement greenhouse gas inventories for forests, really to support reduced deforestation, but also starting to move towards restoration and reforestation. And it was to provide guidance around the use of technologies such as remote sensing, which were really only starting to get picked up by countries, and many of the methods and processes were still poorly understood. And so we were instrumental many years ago in setting that up and authoring many of those documents.
For the people who don't really know what remote sensing is, how does this work?
Sure. Well, when most people think of remote sensing in this space, they really are thinking of satellites, although it can also be sensors or cameras put on planes or drones that are becoming more popular. But realistically, what it is, it's remotely sensing what you're looking at. So taking images or pictures or collecting data from those types of platforms. But in a lot of the cases, what people are looking at is satellite data. And the main reason that's really taken off is that there's just a huge range of new data that's come online in the last 10 years that simply wasn't available in the past.
Fantastic. And going back to the greenhouse gas protocol and the guidance that's being released, when can we expect more guidance to come through?
Yeah, so the authors are currently reviewing the comments that have been made on the first draft, and those will be corrected in over the coming months. And then the piloting, I believe, will be starting either late Q2 or early Q3 this year. And that's going to be a really important process. Having been involved in lots of different protocols and guidance in the past, it's really important to get out early and get testing these things, because that's where you find the problems is in the real life circumstances. So you can do the best thing that you can all from a desk, but going and testing it will be vital. So that's going to be a great process. I think the really interesting aspect of the new protocols is this dealing with not just the scope 1 emissions directly from activities, but also looking at scope 2 and in particular scope 3, and also thinking about issues of bioenergy and wood product use and those types of things that are really unique, that are long-term carbon storage and carbon reduction opportunities that come from the land sector. So it's certainly a challenging piece, and WRI have done a fantastic job of trying to pull this together across all of the time zones and experts and people that are all being engaged. But it's definitely going to be important as more and more companies start looking at, as you mentioned, especially those who are running land or having land holdings, how they start looking at issues of full carbon accounting, scope 3 emissions, insetting, meeting net zero targets.
Incredible. So when this standard is being developed, it must be difficult because there must be lots of different guidelines and business practices and perhaps other standards across the world. Are there many standards out there that have to be combined into one that works for everyone? How does it work?
Yeah, so this is always a challenge, are you trying to write some guidelines and standards, or are you trying to write a cookbook? And we've found that in the past across all of these things, that people start trying to gravitate towards the cookbook instead of trying to come back and say, no, we just need the high-level principles and understanding to ensure that issues of completeness and lack of double counting and ensuring that accuracy is assessed. And all of those types of high-level things are addressed without trying to go down a rabbit hole. That's particularly important, again, in the land sector, because the technologies and opportunities are moving ahead so fast. So getting stuck to a technology that is available today may not be suitable in 5 years' time. That's probably one of the key parts also to look at, is different countries and different organizations have different data collection processes, they have different standards, they have different availability of models. All of those should be able to be used as long as they meet the high-level principles. But including those always makes it a little bit difficult. And it's the same process as you see through the IPCC and through the GFOI. And also, obviously, there's been ISO standards, there's Vera methods, There's the ERF methods in Australia. All of these have got slightly different rules and mechanisms. And so making sure that you're not being basically not pushing those over or effectively contradicting those while still producing something that's actually useful is a challenge.
And just for the listeners who've been wondering what the Vera standard is, what is it?
So Vera is the VCS, voluntary carbon standard, but which many people still refer to it by. But it's a process that sets accounting rules and methods for reducing emissions and creating offsets. So it's been very heavily used in the land sector over the last 15 years. It was one of the very early ones. There's obviously the gold standard as well, which is another popular set of guidelines and protocols for this offsetting. And they have specific methods for saying, here is how you would account in these regions for avoided deforestation or reforestation. And so those have been developed over many years and are used by a lot of people. So it's a lot of good lessons in those as well.
And you mentioned that here in Australia, we have the Emissions Reduction Fund. What is that?
The Emissions Reduction Fund is Australia's current mechanism for trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through a reverse auction scheme. So people bid in to say we will reduce emissions or we will increase sequestration. Sequestration has obviously been a very large component of that in Australia today. And they bid into this and the government will purchase those units. Having said that, that's changed a lot in the last month as the government has opened this up into the private sector. So that's a whole nother discussion. That's probably another podcast, to be honest. But it's very interesting seeing how the government is almost trying to step away from this now and really open it up to the private sector, which is a great step forward.
Great, thank you. And just to talk about the private sector and just landholders and the challenges that people and companies face in accounting for carbon in the land sector, what do you see as the top challenges?
Yeah, look, there's multiple challenges that have been progressively being solved, and it really depends on what you're trying to get at and what you're trying to understand. It makes it either very complicated or relatively simple. So starting out there is probably useful. And so you'll often hear how challenging the land sector is. That's true, but there are solutions. But I'd say, I mean, the key challenge is that we're dealing with biological systems, and biological systems inherently are complex. There's lots of interactions going on in them, both with human processes, but also natural processes. So as we mentioned wildfire before, but we've obviously got all the floods going on at the same time. There's droughts. There's pest attacks. There's lots of things that are going on that can move carbon around. They interact with what us humans are doing, be it deforestation, reforestation, improved land management. So you need to try to understand some of those interactions and the processes as a starting point. The second part of it has been, and we just obviously referred to this, is there's a lot of accounting policy and accounting rules. And so it's not just about saying I have some carbon stocks. What you're trying to get to is understand what those carbon stock changes are. You need to understand what they have been often, because you're trying to look at a baseline. And then you're also trying to project forward. You're trying to say what could they be if I undertake these different scenarios or these different management practices. And in some cases, you've even got accounting rules that use those projections to, as almost a counterfactual. That's important in things like avoided deforestation. So the accounting rules themselves can also make it more complicated when you're laying it over the top, or in some cases, they can actually make it less complicated. If you're quite lucky, you can, what the accounting rules can do is say, don't worry about counting for these specific things, because don't worry, that's a natural process or something like that. And that can simplify it. So this is a really key part. And then the final bit is obviously the measurement and estimation itself. So unlike something like burning diesel, where you know a set number of litres, or as you mentioned, energy use, across a very large area of land, you've got a diverse source of different sources and sinks going in across the landscape. And not one technology is going to get you there to estimate all of those. So it's really about how do you use a mix of models and measurements and ground data and management information to get there. I guess if I was to be really honest about Australia, is that we're very lucky here. I don't think people realise how lucky we've been for the land sector in having decades of experience and effort put on in, especially in the 2000s, to develop the National Carbon Accounting System and the FLINTCAM systems and all of these things that actually allowed farmers to estimate emissions from trees in particular, helped underpin the ERF, and it really provides a great framework for moving forward that many other countries don't actually have. So it's a really interesting space to be in.
Again, with the lucky country, it reminds me of a podcast I recently recorded with Saul Griffith on electrifying everything, and he also mentions that Australia is the lucky country when it comes to renewable energy generation, for instance. So I absolutely agree, we are the lucky country. So just clarifying a few things there. So when you talk about carbon stock changes, what can people envisage when they hear the word carbon stock and carbon stock change?
Yeah, so this is a really core concept, and it's really important to understand, because what you'll often find, there is a big difference. There's a big difference between being able to measure a carbon stock. So maybe being able to go to a forest, measure that forest and say, in 2022, this forest had 150 tons of carbon. And that's a very useful number to know. However, in terms of emissions or removals, every year, it's actually the difference. It's the change in that carbon stock. So what you need to know is, did it go from 150 to 155 the next year, or did it drop? Did you harvest the forest and did it come down to 70? So it's that change aspect that you're using to estimate the emissions and removals. And that is a very, very different question, and it's much harder to measure, and which means that generally where people either use a lot of very simplifying assumptions or more commonly use a series of models. So they're using measurements to create models that can then be used to estimate those changes through time, verify them, make sure they're sufficiently accurate, precise, unbiased, all of those types of things. So it is a really important part of the land sector. Probably the most easiest equivalent is to think about a coal mine. Now, we're not really interested in some ways in how much coal is sitting in the ground in the mine from a climate change perspective. What we care about is how much is getting burnt. And that's similar to the way of thinking about the land sector. It's not the carbon that's standing there right now, it's the carbon and where that's going to change in the future, either up or down.
Hopefully the potential to go up and more carbon to be sequestered. And exactly. the other thing you mentioned was FLINTCAM, which supports how we account for the land sector in Australia. I think you guys developed FLINTCAM. What is FLINTCAM?
So FLINTCAM is the full carbon accounting model. That was where, as a youngster, I cut my teeth back in the Australian Greenhouse Office days, starting in year 2000, actually with Gary Richards, who works for us now as well, which has been a fantastic experience, being able to bring everyone back together. But FLINTCAM is a modelling system. It was designed and built for Australia. It has a couple of key attributes. Firstly, its ability to use time series remote sensing data of forest and forest cover change to look for things like deforestation and reforestation. And people forget that Australia was the first country to do that at a continental scale. That was an incredible effort by CSIRO and the Greenhouse Office and others at the time to build that system. And then FLINTCAM is a conglomeration of existing models that we combined to allow us to estimate the greenhouse gas emissions from those activities. So if we saw an area of forest get cleared, how much carbon was lost because of that? And that was the core concept of FLINTCAM. So that still runs the national inventory. And what we have done over the last 7 years is take all of that experience to build a brand new product called, well, Flint and FLINTpro.
That must have made you incredibly proud to be able to produce such an accounting methodology for all of Australia, and then ultimately to take it globally.
Yeah, at the time, I think it was just a lot of hard work and we didn't think about it. But looking back, it really was. It was a fantastic time. And again, especially as someone fresh out of university, being able to work so closely with a great set of policy experts, the leaders in their field across forestry and soils in universities and CSIRO. And that I've been able to bring that experience of system design and how do you bring all of the science into one area through the rest of my career. And I'm extremely thankful.
Yeah, I can imagine. I've had similar experiences in my professional life as well. So What sorts of trends and challenges are you seeing? We've talked a lot about the challenges of accounting, but just generally speaking, trends in the marketplace, because we hear a lot about the serious problem of loss of biodiversity. Biodiversity is often talked about, natural capital, soil carbon, nature as perhaps an asset class, the task force on nature-related financial disclosures, TNFD. How has the need for your product and services changed over the last few years with so much more attention on nature?
Yeah, look, and especially the last 12 to 24 months has really seen a drastic change. So I can separate it into a few different pieces. Obviously, all of the things you just spoke about then have really started driving the need for better data and actually a more systematic approach. So if you look back to even 5 or 6 years ago, a lot of the methods were very site specific. They were often Excel sheets or simple models or things, because that's really what was always needed. But with all of these new requirements and reporting, and it actually becoming part of almost day-to-day operations, you can't keep going down that path. So the need for tools like FLINTpro that are designed specifically to support a systematization and ongoing annual consistent reporting, no different to the way you'd use financial accounting software, has exploded. I think the really interesting piece has been the shift from government to the private sector. Again, 7 or 8 years ago, a lot of the focus of this was really on governments and what governments can do and what data governments need to make policy and program decisions. Whereas now the real driver is coming out of the private sector. And that's either for setting net zero targets, it's for looking at offset opportunities, it's for reporting sustainability or ESG criteria. There's a huge range of needs out there that need to be addressed. And then the third trend that fortunately is happening at the same time, I think, is a huge change in the available technology. So obviously cloud-based systems help a lot. Remote sensing providers have really exploded over the last couple of years. That's pluses and minuses, obviously. It's a very fractured market. But when you look across the market and find the good ones, what you're seeing is the costs of getting high quality remote sensing products of, say, forest cover has declined probably 70 or 80%. And the accuracy has certainly gone up and the accessibility has gone up. And that's a global trend. And I think that's something that's really going to help the industry into the future. And through that process, we're also seeing lots of great systems coming up for better ground measurements, better model calibrations, linking all of these things together. And that's obviously exactly where we work with FLINTpro, but it means that we get to talk to all of these fascinating groups working on all little individual pieces of the puzzle. So they would be the main changes, especially in the last 12 to 24 months.
Yeah, we've also seen in our work, we've also seen that years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was mostly government driving action, but increasingly the private sector is really stepping up. So it's excellent to see. So going back to my earlier remark that few companies currently account for land sector emissions and removals, even when it's relevant for them, how can companies benefit from your solutions and innovations?
Yeah, look, I mean, you're right. It's been a challenge and most people are focused on the fossil fuel emissions. But as that's been large, it hasn't been solved, as you know, there's still a number of challenges in there. I think people often downplay the difficulty of carbon accounting across the other sectors, and the land sector likes to play up how hard it is. And there's probably a bit of a middle ground there in reality. But I think probably one of the big challenges for groups has been where to start. So very much, it's a lot of noise. There's a lot of people saying we can solve this with a remote sensing platform, or we can solve this with a model. And the reality is that you can't solve it with one technology. It is always going to have to be some form of integrated process to pull these data sets together. The second part has been, what questions are you trying to answer? And it comes a little bit back, for example, to this carbon stock versus carbon stock change question. So a lot of groups going and trying to get estimates of carbon stocks and not thinking about how do we estimate the change down the future to get to what we care about, which is the emissions and removals. So I guess our platform helps in a number of ways. Firstly, it gets to that carbon stock change issue and to the emissions and removals. It's fully spatially explicit. So rather than having to work with lots of GIS data and pull these things together in lots of different ways in a bespoke manner, we can actually automate that process. So we've taken things that, for example, would take days, and we can bring them down to seconds, simply because we've managed to build a framework that can process that data and provide it in a really fast way. And then I think the final step really is how, once you've got all of this data on carbon stocks and carbon stock changes, what buckets do you put it in for your different reporting? So, which parts are sequestration, which parts are emissions, which parts would be reportable under the greenhouse gas protocol, or what sort of land areas or what potential is there under a program like the ERF. So it's applying those policy rules as well, which is really a major aspect of what these systems have to do, and we've been working on.
So can you give us a concrete example of a typical project you would deliver?
Sure. Well, there's not really, these days there isn't a typical one because there's so many different use cases. But ones that people can, one that's probably very tangible for people if they'd like to go and have a look at it, is the Agricultural Stewardship Carbon and Biodiversity Program that was released last year through ANU. And the issue there, of course, or for many farmers, has been, if I plant trees, what's the actual potential sequestration? Can I enter a market? What's all of the challenges there? And traditionally, to get that information was a bit time consuming. You had to understand how FLINTCAM worked, for example. You would typically need to get a consultant. You need to do some mapping. It was a few day process. So what we did instead was we came up with an automated process that allowed a farmer to simply come in, draw a polygon on a map online, which would then go back to the modeling systems, and within 5 to 10 seconds give back a result to say, if you were to plant this area to trees, here's the amount of carbon that would sequester, and here's the potential number of unit flows you could look at into the future. So that's probably a really nice, simple one that people can just go and have a look at online straight away. The other challenge, though, is for much larger clients around the private sector. So there's probably a few key use cases. The first one is annual reporting for their investors around sustainability. That's a simple one. So what's the past emissions been from their land emissions? What is it now? Are they doing better or worse? But more importantly, it's really starting to move towards the projections and scenarios. So I have this land, I'm currently sequestering this much carbon, but what if I do this? Will I get more carbon? And those questions are really coming out of groups that are looking at things like net zero commitments. Because it's not just a matter of saying, I want to be net zero, and you said you did it this year. You need to understand what that means moving forward. So if I'm going to say I'm a net zero producer of, I don't know, grain, some form of grain, I need to know, well, what will my emissions be next year? What will my potential sequestration on my farm be next year? And what's the gap? If there's a gap, am I already positive and I don't need to worry, or am I actually negative? And will I be negative for the next 5 years? In which case, what actions can I undertake to try to become either neutral or positive? So that's a lot of the use cases we're seeing. And then the third one is definitely around carbon markets. So a lot of people looking to do feasibility studies, assessments of potential projects around the world, be they soil carbon, be they avoided deforestation or reforestation, looking at those opportunities and understanding what the potential is for obviously creating offsets or carbon units to sell into the market.
So how would these feasibility studies for carbon markets work? Because carbon markets are currently such a big focus. Everyone seems to be chasing the carbon market. How do these feasibility studies work? Would farmers, for instance, or local governments or any other large landholders come to you directly, or is it through a reseller model? How would it work?
Look, it's a real mix. Most of the time people come to us directly, and we partner with other groups. So a key part with anything in an offset scheme, especially when you're looking at the voluntary schemes or working with other countries, is the greenhouse gas estimation and the projections and the estimate of the offsets is obviously extremely important because that helps drive the financial, what the financial model looks like. But there's a huge number of other aspects around the types of methods you will apply, additionality issues, accounting issues, legal issues, tenure issues. So we are generally, much as we love working in this space, we are a cog inside a very large machine that needs to be turned to make this work. And so, we obviously partner a lot with groups like Pollination and others to help deliver those programs as a whole.
got a couple of specific questions. We're working with a number of metropolitan councils, for instance, that have net zero commitments, and they're looking to increase their tree canopy and their urban forests. Would this be something that you could help our clients with?
Yes, definitely. And we're already working with a couple of local councils now. And I think this is a really interesting space, to be honest. So what we've definitely seen as a bit of a trend in the market over the last 6 months in particular is that the state governments and the local councils are the ones that are really starting to focus on the land sector issues, because they're in control of it. And this is where the rubber hits the road around policy decisions, programs, where you're making decisions on those types of activities, be it emissions from things like clearing forests for new suburbs, even all the way through to planting new trees or looking for offsets across your estate. The complexity varies depending on the type of council that you're looking at. When you get into rural councils with very large traditional land areas, then the types of data that we use for the national accounts and for general farming and carbon accounting practices for private sector work really well. When you start coming down into individual trees inside cities, it does get harder because identifying those trees, understanding the carbon dynamics of those trees is much more difficult than a standard forest. Having said that, a lot of those measurements are being taken for other reasons. I guess one of the interesting parts for urban trees, though, as I'm sure you've seen this before, is yes, they do take up a bit of carbon. It's not a huge amount. There's so many other benefits to having trees in the urban landscape from a climate change perspective, in terms of, obviously urban heat island issues, keeping things cooler, greater shade. All of those are probably a much greater benefit to the climate change problem than the carbon going in the trees, but it's still an important thing to track. And probably one of the big advantages that in the remote sensing world that's coming forward with this now is groups like CSIRO, Nearmap. Others are starting to produce really good canopy maps inside those urban areas, so you can actually start tracking those trees better and better. And that opens up a whole lot of opportunities to link into FLINTpro to do the carbon estimation.
And outside the urban areas, you mentioned regional local governments with more traditional land, is community carbon footprints. So more and more local governments are turning their attention to helping the community reduce emissions. So previously the focus was more in-house, and they were looking at the operational emissions, such as energy use in their buildings, street lighting, fleet, etc. Now they're starting to turn their attention to the community. When you look at emissions in the community, you have, again, the same thing. You've got perhaps natural gas consumption, you've got electricity consumption, you've got people driving around in their cars and in trucks. But another aspect, of course, of community carbon footprints is the land sector and like the whole FOLO sector as a sink and source. Typically, when you look at those community carbon footprints, emissions from agriculture, forestry, and land use are a net sink, so they're typically a negative number. How does this actually work? How is it calculated? Is it total stock that exists in a year, or is it net figures that deal with what is removed or planted? Could you shed some light on that?
Sure. Look, I think that the community programs are really fascinating, and there's been a number of efforts over the last 5 to 6 years to try to do those linkages of even people in urban areas going and supporting tree planting in rural areas, for example, to look for personal offsets or for city-to-city trades and things like that. And whilst those haven't moved forward particularly probably as fast as some people would like, the concept I think is extremely valid and has a lot of really good opportunities. In terms of the individual accounting, I probably can't comment too much on that because it is going to vary from place to place at the moment. And this has been one of the problems of not having good set standards or good systems for doing this, is that often you'll get a group that does something using one protocol or a group that does something using a slightly different protocol. Again, I think that's been absolutely fine for the last 10 years because realistically, that's where we've been. There hasn't been a lot of funding. There hasn't been a lot of interest. And so you do what you need to do to get what you need to get done. That's been the story of climate change. But the last couple of years with the push for that is, I think that's going to change this part a fair bit. I think you'll get much more consistency. You'll get far more accurate. And most importantly, you'll be able to attribute those changes. So one of the challenges, of course, is who owns the carbon? Are you double counting the carbon across different communities? All of these sorts of things. And so again, this isn't at all a criticism of what's been going on. It's simply saying that we've got a really big opportunity here now to really streamline this and get it moving much faster.
Thank you. And Rob, you previously mentioned the agricultural stewardship program, which might be of interest to some of our clients who are meat and dairy producers. Can you tell us a little bit more about that program?
Sure. Look, basically the core concept behind it was to try to say, how can you get smallholder farmers engaged in the carbon market? Primarily because in the past, to bring in people with small areas of land or only wanting to do small tree plantings was really difficult. And that's just the nature of having a large operating market and needing a lot of support, legal support, monitoring support, and things just meant that the cost was too great. You couldn't get it back in the carbon. So it was basically seen as something to say, well, can we do something about this? It was a great program, and still obviously is. It was because of the way it also brought things together. It brought together ourselves on the carbon modelling. It brought together experts like Don Butler on the biodiversity. It brought ANU's expertise in around the control of the market to try to build something that was basically would streamline it and bring people in. And that was trying to serve an area that had been underserved because of the scale of the issue. Of course, the bigger scale people are very well served by the current aggregators in many cases. So it's really trying to fill a bit of a gap in the market. But the nice part about it was, realistically, it showed that we could do these modelling systems across the entire country quite efficiently. And that hadn't really been tried before. And so being able to serve that out with a whole lot of new technologies from us and from other companies was a lot of fun.
And you mentioned the word aggregators. What are aggregators?
So aggregators, it's large carbon companies who will help you develop projects. So they will come to your property, they will help you get through all of the legal aspects, the project planning, the carbon estimation, all of those types of things. They play a really important role in the market because these things aren't easy, especially even once you get these things in the ground. How do you make sure the trees survive? How do you keep monitoring them? All of these types of processes. And if that's not your day-to-day job, then getting someone else to come and do it for you is a very good idea. So that's the roles of those. There's numerous of them, and they all work in a variety of spaces. So some work specifically or very specifically on trees. Others are getting into soil carbon very heavily. Others are a mix. And then there's a whole lot of other units like reef credits and other things that are starting to come up. So it's a really interesting business model that in the last 2 to 3 years has really exploded, again, because of this sudden interest and need to act on climate change. So it's a fascinating market.
Thank goodness that everyone has now recognized the need to act on climate change. With people wanting to look into this, companies wanting to look into this, what would they have to budget for a pre-feasibility or a feasibility study to see what they can do with their land, their vegetation, their soil?
Yeah, look, if you're in Australia, it's probably a bit less than overseas in a lot of cases because we have got all of the systems in place, fortunately, through all of the hard work of people over the last 20 to 30 years. But look, it's obviously going to depend on the complexity of the landscape. It's going to depend on how much area you're looking at. It's going to look at the different projects. But typically, if you're looking at just trying to get some numbers out for an entire property of what the carbon stock changes may have been, you can do something as simple as go to My Farm Key, which is run by Sevo Labs. And for a couple of $100, you can get that initial estimate out of those systems. From there, if you're starting to look at using those things for reporting or for scenario analysis, then it's more of coming to us. So our data backs the My Farm Key carbon estimates, but the My Farm Key has a lot of other great data in the background as well. Then it would start going up, and it depends on how far down the line you want to go. So it could be between 5,000, it could go up to 20,000, it could go to 30,000. It's going to depend on how accurate you're trying to be, what you're trying to do, and where you're trying to get to. But compared to the old days of trying to measure these things, those costs are a small fraction of what it would have cost 5 years ago. So
almost comparable then to the curve of solar PV costs coming down rapidly in cost.
Exactly. And again, I think for a lot of these things, it will continue, especially where a lot of those costs have come in around the remote sensing world. Remote sensing is never going to become free. You can get free remote sensing products from satellites. they're typically not very good. They're good for general large scale analysis. They're not very good for specific things, but the data is becoming more and more available. So.
And Rob, you previously mentioned reef credits, and that brings me to another question. The Commonwealth Government has recently released the Blue Carbon Method under the Emissions Reduction Fund, which unlocks new opportunities for the long-term storage of carbon emissions, such as storing carbon through restoring mangroves and tidal marshes, and reducing methane and nitrous oxide emissions through the reintroduction of tidal flows. Do your solutions work or assist in the blue carbon space, or are you working on innovations to help develop these kinds of carbon storages in the same way you do with land?
Yes, they do. So we've the advantage of FLINTpro is the best way to think of it is a framework. It's like a very sophisticated chassis that we can then bolt new models to and new data to, depending on what's needed to produce estimates. So the current blue carbon method has a very simple calculator behind it that I think is very suitable for getting this off the ground. But as we start to get far more sophisticated, and again, bringing in new mapping processes, and we get better and better data on these mangroves and these forest types, or these ecosystem types, sorry, then the ability to bring that data in and run it and improve it is really where we work. So we have, for example, done mangrove estimates for all of the Pacific using the globally available global mangrove watch data and the IPCC defaults. But the key part there, of course, is that gives an OK number. And then if you need to get better, then you can simply unplug the global data and plug your better data on and get a better result. And so what you're trying to do here is not throw away the framework every time. You're keeping the same framework, and every year you're just adding better data to get more and more accurate. So you can start simple and get complicated rather than stopping because it's all too hard. The other advantage, to be honest, in this is that Australia does have some of the best researchers in the world, at CSIRO and down at Deakin at the Blue Carbon Lab, working on these issues. And so the ability for those types of data to start to come to bear is probably puts us well ahead of the game compared to many other areas of the world.
Great, thank you. And the next question I have revolves around the concept of insetting. You've touched on it previously, but I do want to discuss it in greater detail now. We are working with a number of clients who are dissatisfied with pursuing a carbon offset strategy as part of either their carbon neutral or even net zero commitments. So even when we develop decarbonization pathways and sometime in the future, we want to reach net zero emissions, and for that residual carbon footprint to go to nil by using carbon offsetting, lots of our clients don't want that. Carbon offsetting means that you're investing in carbon reduction or sequestration projects to compensate for your residual emissions. But the problem that some of our clients have with this strategy is that they see carbon offsets as just costs for the business. Of course, there's a large number of our clients who think very differently, but some of our clients just think that it's just a cost rather than an investment, and they see it as being too far removed from the operations. So they have a drive to invest in projects that have a closer connection to their business, perhaps even in their supply chains or through land that they own. So also tying back into the carbon management hierarchy, the traditional carbon management hierarchy where sequestering comes before offsetting. They want to support local projects as well. And they're asking us what the potential for them would be to plant their own forest, either on land that they own or on someone else's. You mentioned previously partnerships between metro and regional areas, for instance. So clients could collaborate with other parties. And looking at the concept of insetting, which is so interesting, it gives you more control and oversight. So it's closer to you. You have it under your control. You determine the project that you want to implement, but it's also more work because you have to go through all these processes, auditing, legal, it's costly, and offsetting seems to be so much easier in comparison. It's simple, it's done at arm's length. And so, for instance, measuring and verifying the emissions saved by an insetting scheme is so much more complex and may not have an established methodology. So what is your opinion on insetting, which seems to be a fantastic idea as a strategy to reach carbon neutrality or net zero?
I agree. I think it really is a strategy, especially for those groups that are directly owning or managing their own land. One of the challenges and one of my personal frustrations, I guess, over the years has been the constant, the land sector is different mentality that's happened. And that's happened through everything from the Kyoto Protocol, through greenhouse gas inventories, through all of these types of things. The challenge with that is it's often been that it means, well, we'll ignore the land sector and we'll count for all these other emissions and we'll consider the land sector as an offset, not thinking of the land sector as, well, this is just yet another source of emissions and potentially negative emissions in removals, and we should be including that in our baselines and our calculations going forward. It's just another emission source. Yes, it has some differences, but that's what it is. And that's very much driven, down an offsetty style of approach. For groups in Australia, obviously, that's been very challenging because Climate Active in particular is a good example of that. It's a great program, but as you were saying, you're basically being pushed down and almost you need to produce an ACCU to even inset. And the cost of that is enormous, as opposed to just being able to say, well, we know what our emissions and removals are and we can use that internally. And I think this is probably where, again, the greenhouse gas protocol guidance that we talked about before from WRI is going to be so important, because it's trying to break down that wall finally and say, no, land is just part of this and it's part of our broader planning. The discussions around insetting and offsetting, I think are maturing a lot at the moment, in particular when either industry groups such as Meat and Livestock Australia are making net zero commitments, or individual farmers or people are saying that they want their products to be carbon neutral for export or even for internal use, is how do you do that? And I think this is where the insetting argument is really going to take off, because there's no point in selling all of your carbon assets if you then have to buy a whole lot of offsets back later on to reach your targets. It's going to be much more efficient. It's going to be much cheaper. It's going to give you much more flexibility in the way that you manage your land if you do that as a piece of work that says, and our land sector is this. So we've done as much emissions reductions as we possibly can this year. And obviously that's, from again, really important, is that reduce first is the key before you consider offsetting or insetting. You can then say, and we've got 2 megatons left, let's say, and across all of our land, we think we've sequestered 3 megatons. So we can be negative and maybe we have some left over that we may wish to sell or you may wish to bank. So this will be a really interesting piece going forward as the pressure comes from numerous angles to reach these net zero targets, and ensuring that double counting isn't occurring is going to become quite important.
So let's just recap this for a bit to see whether I got this all correct. So imagine you're a large landholder, you're a farmer, and you are pursuing carbon neutrality under a scheme such as Climate Active. At the moment, the only pathway for that farmer would be to purchase carbon offsets to get to zero and to claim carbon neutrality. So at the moment, what would need to happen is that farmer would have to go down the ACCU path. Australian Carbon Credit Unit has to get all the methods in place, has to get it audited, verified, all the legals, consulting costs, etc., to get that project up and running, to be then generating Australian Carbon Credit Units that are then need to be retired so that the farmer can claim this for his or her carbon neutrality. That's the current status. So at the moment, there is no opportunity under Climate Active to go and just do the activity anyway and to account for the carbon stock changes and to claim that as part of your net zero journey or your carbon neutrality. Do you think that this might change in future with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol releasing this new guidance? Do you think it will change the thinking?
I certainly hope so, because we really need to give farmers in the land sector basically the flexibility to address their emissions and removals in whatever way they see fit to meet those needs, and locking them into a process that requires a whole lot of additional work to do that is really damaging to that process, in my opinion. And we don't insist on the same things for fossil fuels or other emission sources. So it seems a bit silly to keep demanding the same thing from the land sector. So yeah, I think this is a really big moment for the way that people are looking at this. And it's also a bit of a, sort of throw a bit of caution to the wind around how and whether you decide to sell your carbon credits or not, or your potential excess carbon into the future. Because realistically, as I said earlier, a lot of the impacts of change management have a lag. They don't, or you plant trees, they don't all take the carbon up immediately. You start undertaking regenerative Agriculture, you don't get all the soil carbon on day one. It's going to be something that happens over several years. So if you're aiming to hit carbon neutrality by a year, you really need to be thinking very much around, yes, here's how we're going to reduce our emissions profile, but we can't just go, well, we'll plant trees in 2025 because that'll get us there. You need to be planting the trees now, knowing that they'll be starting to take up more carbon by that time. So they're the sorts of processes that are going to be super important in getting those abilities to run those projections, to make those land management decisions going forward.
Yeah, I also agree. It's important to make those projections and also to be aware of the costs, because you'll be able to, as a farmer, for instance, or a large landholder, you can put your finger on the costs of what this is going to cost you in terms of changed farm practices, equipment you may need to get, seedlings you may need to purchase, whatever costs are associated with that, but you can plot that out. Whereas going for the carbon market is highly volatile, because you're then exposed to the market as opposed to having it all under your control. So would you say that this is potentially a good risk management practice to hold on to your carbon credits, use them for your own carbon neutrality and net zero goal, and to potentially then sell excess credits?
Yes, definitely. I think that's a really key consideration for a lot of producers across the country. Not just driven by commitments here, but obviously, you know, the EU is setting a whole lot of new sustainability and other standards that you may need to be able to meet, even to sell some products out of the country. And so being really careful around what you're doing is going to be key. This is not saying that you shouldn't be selling carbon credits by any stretch of the imagination. There's some fantastic opportunities and lots of great groups working in this right now. But it's just like any other farm business decision. It needs to be made with a very strong eye to the future.
Very good point. So how do you recommend organizations go about achieving net zero emissions, especially the ones with large amounts of land?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's the first one, having been in climate change for so long now, is just reduce emissions. Sometimes people find it surprising that my very first thing isn't about the land sector at all. Most of my comments always revolve around, we just need to get emissions down. And you need to, if you look at the IPCC scenarios, you can see that it's become more and more important over the last 10 to 15 years. The land sector, we're going to need to take us to net negative post 2050 to try to still stay in a 1.5 to 2 degree world. So we can't just be using the land sector to offset current emissions and think about it that way, because we've kind of lost that space in the atmosphere to do that anymore. So realistically, the very first point is to drop emissions. I think the second point, and there's numerous great new technologies coming out to help with that. I think the second point, though, is to then really look at your farming operations, the land that you hold, and have a really good understanding of which pieces are going to be most profitable from ongoing production, which pieces are maybe not so profitable and potentially could be good for creating insets or offsets, or you know, what areas would really benefit from potentially having improved regenerative agricultural practices, or planting trees in stream sides, or all of those sorts of things that are very practical things that can happen these days. And to me, it really does just come back to really good farm planning and looking at some of the new technologies that can help with that type of data. Help give the type of data that can really help with that. Are just amazing. It's not just us. There's some great companies out there like Agronomy and others who are able to produce super high resolution maps for land use planning that you can then guide yourself with into the future. So.
Yeah, Rob, we've almost run out of time, but I'm really keen to hear what you're planning for the future. I've heard so much about what you do, and I can see the merit of your software, your integration, and what you offer to the marketplace. What you're currently working on in the very near future, and what are your plans for in a few years down the track? Where do you see the market going, and how are you going to service that market?
Yeah, look, I think we just see the market growing at the moment very, very rapidly, and it's growing in multiple different ways. So one of the challenges for all of us, I think, is going to be which pieces are you trying to address first, because there are so many issues. It's not just carbon, obviously. There is a fair bit of sort of focus on carbon at the moment, but there are still lots of other issues floating around the land sector, be it erosion, salinity, biodiversity issues. All of these things haven't gone away. It's just that we've picked up a bit of focus on the carbon story at the time. And whilst a lot of the time the actions to undertake those are complementary, sometimes there are trade-offs that need to be made too. So from our side, I think the most exciting parts are the ability to really take this technology out to the entire world. We've obviously done things in the last 12 months, like running 25 meter resolution maps over all of Australia, and providing that through the agricultural stewardship program was a huge step forward. But really working with groups to do that planning. So if I was to list the three things, it's higher quality data and getting it faster so that people can take actions immediately. It's providing that projections and scenario analysis tools so that people can actually understand what the actions are. It's not just trying to estimate what's happened. And finally, it's really taking that broader. So how do we start bringing in the stories of the natural capital accounting around biodiversity, water, and other issues, so that we're trying to address everything that we possibly can in one thing, and we're not accidentally causing bigger problems down the track by some of the decisions we make to address just one issue. So it's a pretty exciting time. And we're really looking forward to it.
I can feel the excitement. So after all that we've discussed, what's the key takeaway message that you want to leave our listeners with?
That the land sector is important, and that it is actually possible to account for it now, and not to be scared of it. It looks scary, it seems complicated, but come and talk to us and we will very happily help guide you through that process and really get this engaged as a key part of solving climate change.
So lots of organizations who would have listened to this podcast would probably want to get in touch with you. How can people connect with you?
Look, I'll usually just go to FLINTpro.com. That will always help. And just send us an email, and we'll obviously reach straight back out, and we can jump on the phone and talk through what you're trying to do and how we can help, and how we can bring some of our other partners to come and help with that as well. I think that is, to be honest, the other great part of the ecosystem here in Australia, is there is a lot of very, very good companies working in this now, and the vast majority of us are all working together highly collaboratively. And that means that we can get to solutions faster, and it means we can really help individuals go and get what they need.
Amazing. Yeah, we'll pop those your contact information in the show notes of this podcast if people are interested. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for your time.
No problems. Thanks for your time. It's been a lot of fun.
That was Rob Waterworth, CEO at FLINTpro and the Mullion Group, talking about emissions and removals in the land sector and using insetting to meet a net zero target. If you know another person who you think will enjoy this podcast, please let them know so that more people can hear about best practice stories of how organizations are moving to net zero emissions. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next episode.